The winter morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the Burrow, casting long golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor. Molly Weasley stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, surveying her domain with the keen eye of a general preparing for battle. Steam rose from her teacup on the scrubbed table, forgotten in her assessment of the task ahead. December 23rd, 2 days until Christmas. She'd been planning this feast for weeks, months, really, if she counted the moment back in September when she'd first begun mentally cataloguing recipes and calculating portions. This year would be special. This year, for the first time since the war, every single one of her children would be home for Christmas. Bill was travelling back from Egypt, bringing Fleur and little Victoire. Charlie had sent word from Romania that he'd managed to wrangle leave from the Dragon Reserve. Percy had, miracle of miracles, requested time away from the ministry, though Molly suspected Audrey had something to do with that. George would be here, of course, closing Weasley's Wizard Wheezes for the holiday. Ron had promised to arrive by Christmas Eve, possibly bringing Hermione and Harry if they could spare the time from Aura training. And Ginny would be home from her first professional Quidditch season with the Holyhead Harpies, full of stories and that fierce, bright energy that made the Burrow feel complete. Everyone home, together, safe. Molly moved into the kitchen properly, her slippers shuffling against the stone floor. The room smelled of years of cooking, a permanent perfume of cinnamon and rosemary, of bread and roasted meat, of the 1,000 meals that had fed her family through lean times and plenty. Copper pots hung in neat rows above the ancient cooker, their bottoms worn bright from decades of use. Wooden spoons stood at attention in the ceramic crock by the sink, everything in its place. She pulled out the drawer beneath the worktop, where she kept her planning parchments. The stack had grown thick over the past weeks, covered in her cramped handwriting and crossed-out revisions. Menu lists, shopping inventories, preparation schedules colour-coded by day and time. Arthur had teased her gently about the organization, but he didn't understand. He couldn't understand. This Christmas had to be perfect. Molly spread the top parchment across the table, weighing down the corners with her wand, a bowl of wooden spoons and 2 slightly mismatched salt cellars. Her finger traced down the menu. Christmas dinner, December 25th, 6 p.m. Sharp turkey, £22 minimum, ordered from Diggory Farm. Roasted potatoes with rosemary honey-glazed parsnips, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, bread sauce, cranberry sauce, with orange chipolata sausages wrapped in bacon, traditional sage and onion stuffing, rich giblet gravy, Christmas pudding, prepare December 23rd, mince pies, brandy butter, trifle below. That. A separate list for Christmas Eve supper. Below that, contingency plans for Boxing Day leftovers. Below that, breakfast menus. She'd even planned what biscuits to have on hand for tea. Some might call it excessive. Molly called it necessary. She picked up her wand, gave it a gentle wave, and summoned her apron from its hook by the door. It flew across the room and settled around her neck, the strings tying themselves in a neat bow behind her back. The fabric was faded, softened by countless washings, decorated with faint stains that no amount of scouring charms could fully remove. Beetroot from 3 summers ago, chocolate from George's birthday cake, a splash of pumpkin juice from the morning Ginny got her Hogwarts letter. A map of memories, really. Molly rolled up her sleeves and approached the pantry. The small cupboard door opened at her touch, revealing shelves that stretched back much farther than the external dimensions suggested. One of Arthur's better attempts at extension charms. Jars of preserved fruits gleamed like jewels in the wandlight she conjured. Sacks of flour and sugar sat in orderly rows. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling, filling the space with the scent of summer gardens remembered. She began pulling out ingredients for the Christmas pudding, setting them on the worktop with careful precision. This had to be done first. The pudding needed 2 full days to set properly, to allow the flavors to marry and deepen, to achieve that perfect dense richness that made it the centerpiece of Christmas dessert. Flour, sweat, breadcrumbs, currants, raisins, sultanas. She'd splurged on the good ones from Diagon Alley. Candied peel that she'd made herself back in October. A jar of glassy cherries that glowed like rubies. Mixed spice, cinnamon, nutmeg. Brown sugar, dark and fragrant. Eggs from their own chickens. A bottle of stout from the leaky cauldron. Brandy, the expensive kind, saved for special occasions. As she assembled everything, Molly's mind wandered through Christmases past. The year Fred and George had charmed all the garden gnomes to sing carols in harmony. The Christmas Percy had given everyone handwritten improvement plans as gifts, earnest and well-meaning in his pompous 12-year-old way. The year Ron had received his clean sweep and nearly crashed it through the kitchen window in his excitement. The last Christmas before Fred... No, she wouldn't think about that now. This Christmas would be perfect, because it had to be, because she needed her family around that table, needed to feed them and care for them and prove to herself that despite everything, despite the war, despite the losses, despite the scars they all carried, the Weasleys were still whole, still together, still a family. Molly reached for her largest mixing bowl, the ceramic one with a hairline crack down one side that had been there so long she couldn't remember its origin. She set it on the worktop with a solid thunk, then retrieved her wooden spoon. Not just any spoon, but the one she always used for Christmas pudding, the handle worn smooth by her mother's hand and her grandmother's before that. Right then, she said aloud to the empty kitchen, let's begin. She measured flour into the bowl with practiced efficiency, using a cup rather than weighing scales, because she knew by feel and experience exactly how much was needed. A pinch more couldn't hurt. The breadcrumbs followed, then the sweet, vegetable sweet how. Since Fleur didn't eat meat, and Molly wanted everyone to be able to enjoy the pudding together. The dried fruits came next, and Molly paused to sort through them with her fingers, removing any stems or overly hard bits. The currants were plump and dark, the raisins sweet smelling. She added them to the bowl in generous handfuls, watching them nestle among the dry ingredients like treasure. Sugar, spices, salt. The kitchen began to smell like Christmas, that particular combination of cinnamon and citrus and dried fruit that made her think of winter evenings and candlelight. She cracked eggs into a smaller bowl, 6 of them, their yolks bright orange from the happy hens in the garden. A quick whisk with her wand set them into a golden froth. Then came the stout, dark and foamy as she poured it in, followed by a generous slug of brandy that made the mixture glisten. Molly poured the wet ingredients into the dry and picked up her grandmother's wooden spoon. The tradition was that everyone in the household should take a turn stirring the Christmas pudding, making a wish as they stirred from east to west in honor of the 3 wise men's journey. But it was only her in the kitchen this morning, and that was fine. She'd have Arthur stir it later, and maybe George when he arrived tomorrow. She began to mix, her wrist rotating in smooth, practiced circles. The spoon cut through the thick batter with satisfying resistance. The smell intensified, brandy and spice and the deep molasses sweetness of brown sugar. From east to west, she murmured, the old words coming automatically. In honor of the wise men who visited the infant Jesus, may this pudding bring joy and health to all who taste it. What did she wish for? The same thing she always wished for, really. Her family, safe and happy and together. The mixture was coming together beautifully, the fruits distributing evenly through the batter, the colour deepening to that rich, dark brown that promised decadent flavour. Molly stirred with steady determination, her shoulder beginning to ache slightly. Christmas pudding batter was heavy work, but she didn't mind. This was love, translated into flour and fruit and effort. After several minutes of stirring, she judged it ready. The pudding basin waited beside the sink, already buttered and dusted with flour. She scooped the thick mixture into it, using her wand to ensure every last bit transferred from bowl to basin. The batter sat heavy and dense, filled with so many fruits it seemed more fruit than batter. Molly cut a circle of parchment paper, the special non-stick kind from the magical grocers, and pressed it against the pudding's surface. Then she covered the basin with a square of muslin cloth, tying it securely with kitchen twine. Her fingers moved automatically through the motions, having done this every December for more than 30 years. The steamer was already prepared, a large pot with a trivet at the bottom and water that she set to boiling with a casual flick of her wand. She lowered the pudding basin into it, settled the lid on top, and adjusted the heat to maintain a gentle, steady simmer. 6 hours of steaming today. Then she'd let it cool overnight and steam it again for 3 hours on Christmas Day to heat it through. Perfect. Molly glanced at the clock on the wall, the special Weasley clock that Arthur had made years ago, with hands for each family member showing their location and status. Most of the hands pointed to various distant locations. Bill at work, Charlie at travelling, Percy at work, Ron at work, Ginny at Quidditch. George's hand hovered over Diagon Alley. Only Arthur's hand pointed to work in the ministry basement. Soon, those hands would all swing toward home. Soon, the kitchen would be full of voices and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family. She just had to make sure everything was perfect for them. Molly turned back to her lists, reviewing the preparation schedule. Tomorrow she'd make the mince pies. The pastry needed to be just right, flaky, but sturdy enough to hold the filling. She'd prepare the bread sauce base, chop the vegetables for roasting, and make the cranberry sauce. Christmas Eve, she'd collect the turkey from the diggories, get it into its brine, and begin the marathon of final preparations that would carry through to Christmas dinner itself. It was ambitious. Perhaps overly so. But Molly Weasley had raised 7 children, survived 2 wizarding wars, and kept the Burrow standing through countless near disasters caused by experimental magic and youthful enthusiasm. She could certainly manage one Christmas feast. The kitchen seemed to settle around her as she cleaned up the pudding-making detritus, wiping down the worktop with a damp cloth, washing the mixing bowl with a spell that made it gleam. Everything back in its place. The copper pots shining, the wooden spoons standing at attention. Through the window she could see the garden under its light dusting of snow, The gnomes had built something that looked suspiciously like a fort near the hedge. The chicken coop needed some repair work. She'd ask Arthur to look at it tomorrow. The old apple tree stood bare-branched against the grey sky, but in summer it would be full of fruit again. Things grew and changed and came back around, seasons cycling as they always had. The pudding steamed gently on the cooker, filling the kitchen with its rich, spiced scent. In 2 days, her family would gather around the table. They would eat the food she'd prepared with such care. They would laugh and argue and tell stories and be together. And for one perfect day, everything would be exactly as it should be. Molly allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea. The other had gone cold during her work, and sat at the kitchen table with her lists spread before her. Outside, the winter afternoon was already dimming toward evening. Inside, the burrow was warm and full of promise. She picked up her quill and began reviewing tomorrow's tasks, making small notes and adjustments in the margins. The Christmas pudding bubbled quietly behind her, patient and steady, slowly transforming into something rich and wonderful. Everything was going according to plan. Everything would be perfect. The kitchen was already warm when Molly descended the stairs on the afternoon of December the 23rd, though she'd banked the fires before bed the previous night. The Christmas pudding sat cooling on the windowsill, where she'd left it after its 6-hour steam, wrapped in its muslin cloth like a sleeping infant. Weak winter sunlight struggled through the windows, casting the familiar room in shades of grey and gold. Molly tied her apron strings and surveyed the day's tasks with the same determined optimism she'd felt yesterday. Mince pies, cranberry sauce, vegetable preparation, bread sauce base. Her lists were propped against the sugar jar, the topmost one covered in her precise handwriting and small check marks from completed tasks. She'd start with the mince pies. They were always popular, and she wanted to make at least 4 dozen to ensure there would be plenty for visitors and Boxing Day and the inevitable midnight raids on the biscuit tin that happened whenever her sons were home. The pastry came together easily under her practiced hands. Flour, butter, sugar, a pinch of salt. She used her wand to keep the butter cold as she rubbed it into the flour, the mixture transforming into something that resembled breadcrumbs. A splash of cold water, a gentle folding motion, and the dough began to cooperate, coming together into a smooth, pliable mass. Molly divided it into 2 portions, wrapped them in clean tea towels, and set them in the cold larder to rest. While the pastry chilled, she tackled the cranberry sauce. The cranberries sat in a bowl on the worktop, deep red and tart-smelling. She'd bought extra this year. Cranberry sauce was Percy's favourite, and she wanted to make sure there was enough for him to have seconds, or thirds. Her chest tightened with unexpected emotion. Percy, requesting time off work to be with family. After years of distance and strained reconciliation, her 3rd son was finally, truly, coming home. She measured sugar into her medium-sized copper pot, added water and orange zest, and set it on the cooker to dissolve. Her wand gave a casual flick to adjust the flame to the perfect temperature. That was when she noticed the first oddity. The flame beneath the pot flickered, then swelled larger than it should have been. Molly frowned and adjusted it again with her wand. The flame obligingly shrank, then immediately grew back to its previous excessive size, licking up the sides of the copper pot with more enthusiasm than necessary. "Behave yourself," she muttered, adjusting it a third time. This time it held steady, though she could swear it was burning slightly hotter than her charm should have allowed. Probably just needed to clean the cooker grates. She made a mental note and turned her attention to the cranberries. The sugar water was boiling now, the orange zest releasing its fragrant oils. Molly tipped the cranberries in, listening for the satisfying sound of them hitting the hot liquid. They'd burst as they cooked, releasing their pectin and creating that perfect thick sauce that complemented turkey so beautifully. She picked up her wooden spoon, a different one than yesterday's pudding spoon, this one shorter with a broader bowl, and gave the pot a gentle stir. The spoon moved through the bubbling mixture, clockwise as she'd directed. Then it reversed direction. Molly blinked. Her hand was still moving clockwise, but the spoon was definitely, unmistakably, stirring counterclockwise. The cranberries swirled in the opposite direction from her motion, as if the pot had decided to override her intentions. She lifted the spoon out, examined it suspiciously, then tried again. The same thing happened. Her clockwise stir became a counterclockwise rotation the moment the spoon touched the liquid. "That's odd," she said to the empty kitchen. Still, the cranberries were cooking properly despite the backward stirring. The berries were beginning to pop and split, releasing their ruby-red juices into the syrup. Molly decided not to worry about it. Magic could be temperamental sometimes, especially old kitchen magic that had been layered over decades of use. Perhaps some of Arthur's tinkering with Muggle appliances had created an odd interaction with the cooker's enchantments. She left the sauce to simmer, making another mental note to mention it to Arthur when he got home. The pastry had rested long enough. Molly retrieved it from the larder, unwrapped the first portion, and began rolling it out on the floured worktop. The dough was perfect, smooth, pliable, easy to work with. She rolled it to about a 1/4 inch thickness, then reached for her circular cutter to stamp out rounds for the pie bases. 12 rounds cut and pressed into the waiting muffin tin. She spooned mincemeat into each one, the jar she'd made back in November, rich with dried fruits and spices and a generous splash of brandy. The filling glistened darkly in each pastry case. Now for the tops. Molly cut star shapes from the remaining pastry, intending to place them over each pie in the traditional style. She arranged the first 6 stars on their pies, pressing the points gently to seal them to the edges. Then she reached for the 7th star. It lifted off the worktop before her fingers touched it. Molly froze, her hand outstretched. The pastry star hovered at eye level, rotating slowly in mid-air. She definitely hadn't cast a levitation charm. She hadn't even raised her wand. "Come here," she said firmly, reaching for it. The pastry star drifted lazily upward, just out of reach. Molly's frown deepened. She raised her wand and cast a proper summoning charm. Axio Pastry. The star shot toward her so fast she barely caught it, the delicate pastry crumpling slightly in her surprised grip. Behind her, the remaining pastry stars on the worktop all lifted into the air simultaneously, spinning in a slow circle above the table like a constellation. "What in Merlin's name?" She pointed her wand at them. "Finite incantatum." The stars dropped back to the worktop with soft thuds. Molly stood, very still, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted. Kitchen magic shouldn't behave this way. Her wand was working perfectly fine. The summoning charm had been overly effective, if anything. But she definitely hadn't cast a levitation charm on those pastry cutouts. Perhaps she had, and simply didn't remember. She'd been mentally running through tomorrow's tasks while working. Maybe she'd cast it absent-mindedly. That didn't feel right, but Molly couldn't think of another explanation. She was getting older, after all. Moments of absent-mindedness happened. She finished topping the mince pies carefully, keeping a wary eye on the pastry stars in case they decided to take flight again. They behaved themselves. Once all 12 pies were assembled, she brushed them with beaten egg to give them a golden shine and slid the tin into the oven. The oven temperature gauge swam before her eyes. Molly leaned closer, squinting. The needle that should have pointed steadily at 180 degrees was swinging back and forth like a pendulum, swooping from 150 to 210 and back again in rhythmic waves. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered. She adjusted the temperature dial. The needle continued its wild swinging, completely ignoring her input. Molly tried a temperature-regulating charm, speaking the incantation clearly and precisely. The needle slowed its movement, steadied for a moment at the correct temperature, then resumed its pendulum swing. This was getting ridiculous. Still, when she opened the oven door to check, the interior felt approximately the right temperature. Perhaps the gauge was simply broken, giving false readings while the actual heat remained steady. That would be easy enough to fix. She'd ask Arthur to look at it tomorrow. Molly checked on the cranberry sauce, which had thickened nicely despite its backward stirring. She poured it into a clean jar, sealed it with wax, and set it aside to cool. One more task completed. The afternoon was advancing, shadows lengthening across the kitchen floor. Arthur would be home soon, and she wanted to have the vegetables prepared before dinner. Tomorrow would be frantic enough without adding vegetable chopping to the list. She levitated a sack of potatoes from the pantry. At least that charm worked normally, and began peeling them at the sink. The peeler moved in smooth, efficient strips, removing the skin in long curls that dropped into the scrap bucket. Peel, rinse, set aside. Peel, rinse, set aside. The rhythm was soothing, meditative. Behind her, she heard a soft scraping sound. Molly glanced over her shoulder. The muffin tin with its baking mince pies was rising slowly off the oven rack, floating upward inside the oven like a levitating platform. No, 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 down! She abandoned the potatoes and lunged for the oven, yanking the door open. The tin had risen nearly to the top of the oven cavity, dangerously close to the upper heating element. She grabbed it with a kitchen towel, still hot, but not burning, and pulled it out, setting it firmly on the stovetop. The mince pies looked fine, their pastry just beginning to turn golden, but they should have been sitting on the middle rack, not floating around the oven like enchanted stepping stones. Molly's hands shook slightly as she checked the oven rack. It was solid, properly positioned, showing no signs of having been moved. So what had lifted the tin? She took a deep breath. Perhaps there was some residual magic from yesterday's pudding steaming. Sometimes spells could linger, especially with food magic that carried intent and emotion. She'd been pouring love and care into yesterday's work. Maybe it had created an excess of magical energy that was now manifesting in odd ways. That seemed reasonable. Magic was about intention, after all. Molly returned to her potato peeling, though she kept glancing at the mince pies to make sure they stayed put. They sat innocently on the stovetop, browning nicely from residual heat, giving no indication that they'd been attempting escape moments earlier. The pile of peeled potatoes grew. She'd need at least 3 dozen for Christmas dinner. Her children could eat enormous quantities of roasted potatoes. She was halfway through the sack when she heard the water in the sink begin to gurgle. Not the normal sound of water draining. A gurgling, like someone gargling with mouthwash. Like the drain was trying to communicate. Molly stared down at the sink. The water swirled counterclockwise, the same direction as the backward stirring spoon, and continued its peculiar gurgling song. As she watched, a small potato peel rose up from the drain, propelled by a spout of water, and landed on the counter beside her. "That's enough," she said sharply, though she wasn't sure what she was addressing. The sink, the house, the universe. She finished the potatoes quickly, storing them in a pot of cold water to prevent browning, then moved on to the parsnips and Brussels sprouts. These she peeled and chopped without incident, though she remained hyper-aware of every sound in the kitchen, every flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. The mince pies finished baking. Molly pulled them from the oven, using both hands this time, keeping a firm grip, and set them on the cooling rack. They looked perfect, their pastry golden and their star tops crisp at the points. The smell was heavenly, all buttery pastry and spiced fruit. The cooling rack began to spin, slowly at first, then gathering speed. The mince pies rotated in a sedate circle, like horses on a carousel. Molly grabbed the edge of the rack to stop it, and it resisted her grip for a moment, before reluctantly becoming still. "Right," she said to the kitchen at large. "That's quite enough strangeness for one day." She transferred the mince pies to a regular plate. No magic, just her hands, and covered them with a clean tea towel. The cooling rack she shoved into the back of a cupboard, just in case it decided to start spinning again. The sound of the garden gate squeaking announced Arthur's return from the ministry. Molly heard him stamping snow off his boots in the shed, whistling cheerfully off-key. The normalcy of the sound was deeply reassuring. Arthur came through the door in a swirl of cold air and warm affection, his balding head rosy from the winter chill, his robes slightly askew. "Something smells wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek. "Have you been baking all day?" "More or less," Molly said. "Arthur, have you noticed anything odd about the kitchen lately?" "Odd how?" He hung his travelling cloak on its hook and loosened his ministry badge. "The magic seems temperamental, spells not working quite right, things moving on their own." Arthur's face lit up with interest, the same expression he got whenever someone mentioned Muggle technology. "Really? What sort of things?" Molly described the day's incidents. The backward stirring, the levitating pastry stars, the swinging temperature gauge, the floating muffin tin, the spinning cooling rack. As she spoke, the events sounded almost absurd, like the plot of a children's story, rather than genuine problems in her kitchen. Arthur scratched his head thoughtfully. "Could be a build-up of residual magic. This kitchen's seen a lot of spell work over the years. Your cooking charms, the boys' early attempts at magic when they were learning. That time Fred and George tried to enchant the sink to do the washing up for them. Layers upon layers of intent and energy. So what do I do about it?" "Might sort itself out," Arthur said optimistically. "Or we could try a general cleansing charm. Though," he hesitated. "Though what?" "Well, you know how the Burrow can be. It has its own personality sometimes. All old houses do, but magical homes especially. Maybe it's just in a playful mood." Molly wanted to argue that playful was fine for garden gnomes, but not for the kitchen where she was trying to prepare the most important Christmas dinner in years. but she swallowed the retort. Arthur meant well, and perhaps he was right. Perhaps the house was just expressing itself, and the oddities would fade once the excitement of having everyone home settled in. "Help me with dinner?" she asked instead. They prepared a simple meal together. Leftover chicken, fresh bread, some of yesterday's soup. Nothing fancy, nothing that required complicated spell work. The cooker behaved itself. The pots sat still. The utensils cooperated. "See?" Molly told herself as they ate. "Nothing to worry about." But as she washed the dishes after dinner, by hand, not trusting any magic after today's events, she couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach. Tomorrow would be even busier. More baking, more preparation, more complex spells and charms. What if the kitchen decided to be even more temperamental? She dried the last plate and hung the tea towel to dry. Through the kitchen window, the December darkness had settled completely, turning the garden into shadow and silhouette. A few stars were visible between the clouds. The Christmas pudding still sat on the windowsill, patient and perfect in its muslin wrapping. At least that had gone according to plan. Molly extinguished the lights with a wave of her wand. That charm, at least, worked exactly as it should, and followed Arthur upstairs to bed. Tomorrow was another day. Tomorrow she'd tackle the remaining tasks with fresh energy and determination. Tomorrow everything would go smoothly. It had to. Behind her in the darkened kitchen, the copper pots hanging above the cooker swayed gently, though there was no breeze to move them. The wooden spoons in their crock shifted position, rearranging themselves into a new configuration. The cooker's temperature gauge spun in one complete circle before settling back to its resting position. And deep in the cupboard, where Molly had banished it, the cooling rack rotated one final defiant turn before becoming still. Molly woke on Christmas Eve morning with the determined optimism of someone who refused to acknowledge that anything could go wrong. The oddities of yesterday had been just that. Oddities. Flukes. Perhaps Arthur was right about residual magic, or perhaps she'd simply been tired and imagined some of it. Either way, today was a new day, and she had far too much to accomplish to worry about temperamental kitchen equipment. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on her warmest jumper and her working robes, the ones with the reinforced hem that could withstand flour spills and potion splashes. Arthur still slept, snoring softly, one arm flung across her side of the bed. She kissed his forehead gently and made her way downstairs, her wand lighting the way through the familiar passages of the Burrow. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar. Molly frowned. She distinctly remembered closing it last night. But perhaps Arthur had come down for a glass of water in the night and forgotten to pull it shut. It wouldn't be the first time. She pushed the door open fully and reached for the light switch. Then she stopped, her hand frozen in midair, her mouth falling open. The overnight bread dough had escaped. She'd set it to rise in its bowl on the worktop before bed. A simple yeast dough for Christmas morning rolls, covered with a clean tea towel and left in the warm kitchen to do its work. Bread dough was supposed to double in size, perhaps triple, if the conditions were particularly favorable. This dough had expanded to fill half the kitchen. It spilled over the edges of the bowl like a pale, yeasty waterfall, spreading across the worktop, oozing down the cabinet fronts, pooling on the floor in puffy mounds. The tea towel that had covered it lay crumpled on top of the mass like a flag of surrender. The dough was still rising, still expanding, its surface bubbling gently as the yeast continued its enthusiastic work. Molly stood, frozen, in the doorway, her mind struggling to process the scene. The dough had consumed the better part of the available floor space, forming strange organic shapes that reminded her uncomfortably of the herbology greenhouses at Hogwarts. A tendril of dough had reached the leg of the kitchen table and was slowly climbing upward. "No," she said weakly. "No, no, no." She waded into the room, her slippers sinking into the spongy mass. It was warm and alive beneath her feet, still actively fermenting. How much yeast had she added? She'd been so careful, measuring exactly as the recipe specified. 1 packet, standard amount. Nothing that should have created this dough apocalypse. Molly raised her wand, trying to think of an appropriate spell. Reduction charms were typically used for packing trunks, not reversing bread explosions. Could she vanish it? But that seemed wasteful, and some part of her mother's instinct rebelled at the thought of destroying perfectly good food, even if that food had staged a rebellion. "Reducio," she tried, pointing at the nearest mound. The dough shrank obediently, for about 3 seconds. Then it puffed back up to its previous size, as though offended by her attempt to constrain it. In fact, it seemed to expand even more aggressively, sending a new wave rolling toward the pantry door. Molly tried a freezing charm. The surface of the dough developed a thin crust of ice, but beneath it she could feel the mass still bubbling, still rising. The ice cracked and fell away in sheets. A banishing charm sent one section of dough flying across the room, where it hit the wall with a wet slap, and immediately began spreading outward again, defying gravity to climb toward the ceiling. "Arthur!" Molly's voice came out higher-pitched than she'd intended. "Arthur!" She heard thumping from upstairs, the sound of her husband lurching out of bed in alarm. His footsteps thundered down the stairs, and he burst into the kitchen still wearing his nightshirt, wand drawn, ready to face whatever emergency had caused his wife to scream his name. He stopped, blinked, stared at the sea of bread dough. "Molly," he said carefully, "why is there so much dough?" "I don't know." The words came out closer to a wail than she'd intended. "I followed the recipe exactly. 1 packet of yeast, proper measurements, everything by the book. I've made this recipe 100 times, Arthur, 100 times." Arthur waded into the dough, which came up past his ankles. He poked it experimentally with his wand. The dough jiggled, sending ripples across its surface. "It's still rising. I can see that." "Have you tried?" "Yes. Reduction charms, freezing charms, banishing charms. Nothing works. It just keeps growing." Arthur scratched his head, making his thinning hair stand up at odd angles. "Well, this is certainly unusual." Molly wanted to laugh or cry, or possibly both. Unusual. That was one word for it. Catastrophic might be another. Disastrous. Absolutely bloody impossible. Together, they tried various spells and counter-charms. They attempted to scoop the dough back into the bowl, but it had spread too far and was too heavy to lift. They tried cutting it into smaller sections, but each section continued rising independently, like multiplying after being divided. They even tried reasoning with it, which Arthur insisted sometimes worked with temperamental, magical objects, though Molly suspected he was grasping at straws. The dough remained unmoved by their pleas. By the time they gave up, both of them were covered in flour, exhausted, and no closer to solving the problem. The kitchen looked like a yeast experiment gone horribly wrong, which, Molly supposed, was exactly what it was. "I'll get some buckets," Arthur said weakly. "We can at least try to contain it." While he fetched buckets from the shed, Molly made her way carefully to the pantry, climbing over dough mountains to reach the door. She needed to check on the turkey. She was supposed to collect it from the diggories today, get it into its brine, begin the slow process of preparing it for tomorrow's roasting. She opened the pantry door. The turkey stared back at her with glassy eyes, frozen absolutely solid, despite the warming charm she'd placed on the cold storage shelf yesterday. Frost covered its feathers. Ice crystals sparkled on its wattles. She rapped on it with her knuckles. It rang like a bell. "No?" Molly whispered. "Please, no." She tried a thawing charm. The turkey remained stubbornly frozen. She tried a heating charm. Nothing. The bird sat there like a poultry statue, mocking her preparation schedule, her careful planning, her determination to make this Christmas perfect. Molly backed out of the pantry and nearly tripped over a particularly ambitious swell of bread dough. She caught herself on the doorframe, breathing hard, feeling something tight and panicky building in her chest. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not with Bill and Charlie arriving this evening, with George already on his way, with Percy due tomorrow morning. Not with this being the first Christmas since the war, that they'd all be together, all safe, all home. She made her way to the cooker, intending to at least make a cup of tea to steady her nerves before tackling the impossible task ahead. But when she reached for the kettle, it skittered away from her hand like a nervous cat, sliding across the stovetop. "Oh, come on," she said, exhausted frustration bleeding into her voice. She grabbed for it again. The kettle hopped sideways, then backwards, then did a little pirouette, before settling just out of reach. Behind her, she heard Arthur returning with buckets. Then she heard him stop, heard his sharp intake of breath. Molly turned. Every pot and pan in the kitchen was moving. The copper pots above the cooker swung on their hooks in complex patterns, creating rhythms that almost sounded musical. The frying pans on the shelf were rearranging themselves by size, then by color, then seemingly at random. The saucepans were stacking themselves into a wobbly tower. The mixing bowls had formed a circle on the floor that wasn't covered in bread dough, and were rotating like a carousel. The wooden spoons were conducting. They stood upright in their crock, waving back and forth in time with the swinging pots, as though leading an invisible orchestra. The spatulas joined in, flipping in rhythm. The whisks spun on their handles. Molly's careful, organized, perfectly arranged kitchen had become a symphony of culinary chaos. She watched a colander roll past, bouncing slightly, followed by a gravy boat sailing through the air with unusual grace. The measuring cups were playing what appeared to be a game of hide-and-seek, ducking into cupboards and popping out again with gleeful abandon. "Finite incantatem," Arthur shouted, his wand raised high. The spell rippled through the kitchen like a wave. For a moment, one blessed moment, everything stopped. The pots hung still. The wooden spoons slumped in their crock. The measuring cups clattered to the floor. Then, slowly, deliberately, the kitchen utensils resumed their activities. A pot lid spun past Molly's head like a discus. The teapot, her favorite teapot, the one that had belonged to her mother, began whistling despite having no water in it and no heat beneath it. The oven door swung open and shut, like a mouth trying to speak. Arthur looked at Molly. Molly looked at Arthur. "Perhaps," Arthur said slowly, "we should step outside for a moment." They retreated to the garden, closing the kitchen door behind them. Not that it seemed to make much difference. Through the window, they could see the continued chaos. Utensils dancing, dough spreading, the whole room in gleeful rebellion against order and sanity. The December morning was cold and quiet. Snow covered the vegetable patch. The chicken coop was peaceful, the birds just beginning to wake and murmur. A garden gnome poked its head out from behind the shed, took one look at Molly's face, and wisely retreated. "I can't do it," Molly heard herself say. The words emerged flat, defeated, so unlike her usual determined voice that they didn't sound like they belonged to her. "I can't make Christmas dinner, Arthur. I can't. The turkey's frozen solid. There's bread dough consuming the kitchen. Every piece of equipment I own has decided to stage a mutiny. I can't." Her voice cracked. To her horror, she felt tears building behind her eyes. She, who had held the family together through war and loss and 7 children's worth of chaos. She, who had faced Death Eaters in her own home and won. She was being defeated by her own kitchen. Arthur's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. "It's all right, Molly." "It's not all right. The children will be here soon. Bill and Charlie tonight. George probably by afternoon. What am I supposed to feed them? How am I supposed to make this Christmas special when I can't even boil water without the kettle running away?" "We'll figure something out," Arthur said, though he sounded less than certain. "We could go to the leaky cauldron, or perhaps send an owl to—" "No." Molly pulled away, wiping fiercely at her eyes. "This was supposed to be perfect. I needed—" She couldn't finish the sentence. How could she explain that the perfect Christmas dinner represented so much more than food? That it was her way of proving everything was all right, that they were whole, that they'd survived and could still be a family despite the chair at the table that would always be empty? That she needed to feed them and care for them because that was what she knew how to do. And if she couldn't do that, what use was she? Through the kitchen window, a saucepan lid flew past, followed by what appeared to be the entire collection of tea towels, billowing through the air like flags. Arthur squeezed her hand. "Come on, let's go see if George might have any ideas. He'll be here soon anyway. And if anyone understands misbehaving magic, it's—" He stopped. They both stopped, because George might understand. George, who had run a joke shop with Fred. George, who knew every experimental spell and prank enchantment they'd ever invented. George, who was arriving today, who would walk into the Burrow expecting warmth and home and Christmas, and find instead his mother defeated in the garden and the kitchen staging a revolution. "George," Molly repeated, hope flickering weakly in her chest. "Yes, perhaps George will know what to do." She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face her kitchen once more. Behind them, the chickens had begun to cluck in alarm. When Molly glanced back, she saw why. Several loaves' worth of bread dough had escaped through a gap in the kitchen window and was oozing slowly across the garden path, leaving a trail of yeasty destruction in its wake. This was going to be a very long day. George Weasley arrived at 10:30, carrying a carpet bag in one hand and a wrapped package under his arm that was making suspicious ticking noises. He came through the garden gate, whistling a Celestina Warbeck tune, his breath misting in the cold air, entirely unprepared for the scene that awaited him. Molly and Arthur were in the front garden, attempting to wrangle escaped bread dough back toward the house using levitation charms and what appeared to be a butterfly net. The dough was winning. George stopped mid-whistle. His bag slipped from his fingers and landed in the snow with a soft thump. "Mum," he called. "Dad, why is there bread dough everywhere?" Molly looked up from where she was trying to scoop a particularly aggressive blob of dough into a bucket. Her hair had escaped its bun and stuck out at wild angles. Flour covered her robes. Her face was flushed with exertion and frustration. "George," she said, and her voice carried such relief that George immediately dropped the wrapped package and hurried toward them. "Oh, thank Merlin you're here. The kitchen has gone mad." "Mad how?" "Mad as in everything's moving on its own. The turkey won't thaw, the bread dough won't stop rising, and I think the teapot might be attempting to brew itself," Arthur said, brandishing the butterfly net at a tendril of dough that was making a break for the chicken coop. "We've tried every counter charm we know." George bent down and poked the nearest mound of dough experimentally. It quivered under his finger, then expanded another few inches, as if offended by his touch. "Blimey, that's actually quite impressive. How much yeast did you use?" "The normal amount?" Molly's voice was strained. "I've been making bread for 30 years, George. I know how much yeast to use." George held up his hands in surrender. "I believe you, Mum. I just meant... Well, this is the sort of thing that happens when someone's enchanted the ingredients, or charmed the mixing process, or..." He stopped, a strange expression crossing his face. Molly noticed immediately. Years of motherhood had given her a finely tuned sense for when one of her children was keeping something from her. "George, what is it?" "Nothing. Probably nothing. George Frederick Weasley." He winced at the full name treatment. His remaining ear, the one Mad-Eye Moody's curse hadn't taken, turned slightly pink. "I just had a thought, a memory, really, of something Fred mentioned once, years ago. But it couldn't be related to this. Could it?" Arthur abandoned his dough wrangling and came to stand beside Molly, both of them fixed on their son with identical expressions of parental interrogation. George shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly looking much younger than his 27 years. "He talked about enchanting the kitchen," George said slowly, reluctantly. "It was 3 years ago, maybe 4, before the war really kicked off properly. He'd been reading about sympathetic magic, household enchantments, that sort of thing. Said he wanted to do something nice for you, Mum." Molly's chest tightened. Fred, always trying to make her laugh, even when his methods gave her grey hairs. "What kind of enchantment?" "I don't know exactly. He was being secretive about it. Said it was a surprise. I assumed he'd either finished it, and we just hadn't noticed, or he'd abandoned the idea when we got busy with the shop." George's voice had gone quiet. "After he died, I didn't think about it again. There were so many things we'd been working on, so many half-finished projects. I couldn't look at most of them." The garden fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of the bread dough and the distant clucking of chickens. Molly felt Arthur's hand find hers and squeeze gently. "But if he did finish it," George continued, "and if it's been lying dormant all this time, waiting for some trigger or condition to activate, well, that would explain why your kitchen suddenly developed a personality." "A trigger," Molly repeated. "What sort of trigger?" "That's the thing. I don't know. Fred was always better, at the theoretical stuff, the complex layered enchantments. I was more about the practical execution, the flashy effects. George's throat worked as he swallowed. But if this is his magic, there'll be documentation somewhere. He documented everything, especially the projects he was proud of. Drove me mad, all his note-taking, but... He trailed off, staring at the house with an expression Molly couldn't quite read. Grief and curiosity, and something that might have been hope, all tangled together. Where would he keep notes? Arthur asked gently. His room, probably, unless Mum's cleared it out. Molly shook her head. She'd cleaned around Fred's belongings, dusted his shelves, changed his sheets regularly so they wouldn't yellow. But she hadn't moved anything, hadn't packed anything away. Some part of her couldn't bear to, even 3 years later. The room stood as he'd left it, frozen in time, a shrine to the son she'd lost. "I'll look," George said. He started toward the house, then paused. "Mum, don't take this the wrong way, but maybe you should stay out here. If the kitchen's acting up because of Fred's magic, having more people inside might make it worse." Molly wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too covered in bread dough to protest effectively. She nodded, and George disappeared through the front door. Arthur guided her to the garden bench, the one he'd built 20 years ago, slightly lopsided but sturdy, and they sat together in the weak winter sunlight. Around them, the bread dough had finally stopped its aggressive expansion, forming strange sculptural mounds across the garden, like modern art made of yeast. "I just wanted Christmas to be perfect," Molly said quietly. "I know, love. I wanted everyone together, everyone safe and happy. I wanted to feed them properly, to show them that despite everything, we're still a family, that home is still here, still standing." Arthur's arm came around her shoulders. "Home has never been about the food, Molly, though your cooking is wonderful, of course. But home is this, us, the people, not the perfection." Molly leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent of ministry parchment and satisfaction powder and home. "You're too wise for your own good sometimes. Someone has to balance out your stubborn determination to do everything yourself." She almost laughed. Almost. Inside the house, they could hear George moving around, footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing, the creak of floorboards in Fred's old room. Molly tried not to think about what it must be like for him, searching through his twins' belongings, confronting memories 3 years cold. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Molly was beginning to worry when George emerged from the house, clutching a piece of parchment covered in Fred's distinctive untidy scrawl. His face was pale, but his eyes were bright, the way they used to look when he and Fred had figured out a particularly complex bit of magic. "Found it," he said, his voice rough. "It's... Mum, you're not going to believe this." He handed her the parchment. Molly had to squint to read Fred's handwriting, which had always been atrocious, even by Weasley standards. The page was covered in magical formulae, ingredient lists, notes in the margins, and several small diagrams showing what appeared to be the kitchen layout. At the top, in large letters underlined 3 times. Project, Christmas Miracle. Below that, Mum always tries to do everything herself. Every Christmas, every birthday, every bloody Tuesday. She works herself to exhaustion, making sure we're all fed and happy. Time to fix that. Molly's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus on the rest of the notes. Household enchantment, sympathetic magic tied to kitchen implements and ingredients. Goal. Make cooking easier, when help is offered as present, increasingly difficult when working alone. Gradual escalation ensures safety. Nothing dangerous, just increasingly absurd until the point is made. Activation trigger. Major family gathering. Christmas holiday reunion. When all or most family members present at Burrow. Key condition. Cooperation. Magic recognizes individual versus collaborative effort. Kitchen behaves properly only when family members work together. More helpers. Smoother magic. Soul worker. Controlled chaos. Note to self, tell Mum eventually, after she's experienced it once. She'll probably hex me, but it'll be worth it. George's voice was thick with emotion. He wanted you to let us help, Mum. That was the whole point. The kitchen was supposed to make it impossible for you to do everything alone, to force you to accept that we wanted to be part of it. That Christmas isn't about you serving us. It's about all of us being together. Molly couldn't speak. She stared at the parchment, at her dead son's handwriting, at the careful thought he'd put into creating this elaborate, frustrating, wonderful enchantment. He'd known her so well, known that she'd never ask for help, that she'd work herself to exhaustion rather than admit she needed anyone. So he'd created magic that left her no choice. There's more, George said quietly. He pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. Instructions for how to work with it. Specific things that help the magic cooperate. Multiple people in the kitchen, shared tasks, collaborative decision-making. And see here? He even planned for different family members' skill levels. The magic adjusts based on who's helping. If you've got someone who can't cook to save their life, it gives them easier tasks. He thought of everything, Arthur said wonderingly. He always did, George replied. That was Fred, 10 steps ahead, thinking through every angle, making sure everyone was taken care of. His voice cracked slightly. Even after he's gone, he's still looking out for us. Molly folded the parchment carefully, pressing it against her chest. 3 years. Fred had enchanted the kitchen 3 years ago, and it had waited patiently through quiet dinners and small family meals, lying dormant until the conditions were exactly right. Until Christmas Eve, with everyone coming home, with Molly determined to do it all herself. Until Fred's magic could deliver its message. You don't have to be alone. So what do we do? Arthur asked practically. We've got Bill and Charlie arriving tonight, Percy tomorrow morning, Ron and the others by tomorrow afternoon. We still need to prepare Christmas dinner. George grinned, a familiar expression, though sadder than it used to be, missing the mirror image that should have been beside him. We do what Fred wanted. We cook together. All of us, the whole mad family, crammed into that kitchen, making a right mess of it. But I don't have a plan for that, Molly protested weakly. I don't have assignments or schedules or... Exactly, George said gently. That's rather the point, I think. Molly looked at the house, where her kitchen waited with its rebellious pots and expanding bread dough and frozen turkey. Then she looked at the parchment in her hands, at Fred's handwriting, explaining how much he'd loved her, even if he'd shown it in the most chaotic way possible. All right, she heard herself say. All right, we'll do it together. But someone's going to have to deal with that bread dough first. I've got an idea about that, George said. Involves the chickens and a very large oven. It's mad enough that Fred would have approved. Arthur laughed. Actual laughter, bright and genuine. Your mother's going to have heart failure. Probably, George agreed cheerfully. But at least we'll all be together when it happens. Molly stood, brushing dough remnants off her robes. Right then. Let's go see what else Fred's left us." They walked toward the house together, 3 Weasleys facing down an enchanted kitchen with nothing but each other, and a dead boy's love to guide them. Behind them, a garden gnome emerged cautiously from behind the tool shed, assessed the situation, and decided that whatever was happening, it was probably safe to come steal vegetables now. Inside the burrow, the kitchen waited. The copper pots swayed gently on their hooks. The wooden spoons shifted in their crock. The oven door opened and closed once, almost like a welcoming smile. The magic could feel them coming. The magic knew. And deep in the enchantment Fred had woven 3 years ago, a final instruction activated, one he'd coded specifically for this moment. When Mum finally understands, when she finally lets everyone help, make it brilliant. Make it messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Make it Christmas. The burrow, which had been home to Weasleys for generations, hummed with anticipation. This was going to be interesting. By the time Bill and Charlie arrived that evening, the burrow's kitchen had been transformed into something between a military operation and a 3-ring circus. Molly had finally accepted, after another bout of dancing spatulas and a colander that insisted on wearing itself as a hat, that Fred's enchantment wasn't going to be reasoned with or overcome. It had to be worked with, which meant embracing the chaos. Bill came through the door first, Fleur behind him, with little Victoire bundled in her arms. They stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. George standing on a chair, trying to wrestle a levitating stockpot back to the stovetop. Arthur consulting Fred's notes while covered head to toe in flour. And Molly herself surrounded by approximately 17 loaves worth of bread dough that they'd finally managed to portion into something resembling control. "Maman?" Victoire asked in her small voice, pointing at the wooden spoon that was conducting an invisible orchestra from the utensil crock. "Oui, ma chérie," Fleur said faintly. "That is très magique." "Bill." Molly abandoned her dough wrangling and threw her arms around her eldest son. He was solid and warm and real, and for a moment she just held him, breathing in the scent of Egypt, sand and sun and foreign spices that still clung to his travelling robes. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here." "Mum, what's happened to the kitchen?" Bill asked, though he was smiling. Nothing much fazed Bill anymore. Not after his encounter with Fenrir Greyback had left him scarred and changed. A kitchen full of mobile cookware was mild in comparison. "Fred happened," George called from his chair. "Even from beyond the grave, he's causing chaos." Charlie burst through the door next, nearly colliding with Bill in his enthusiasm. He was broader than when he left for Romania years ago, his skin weathered and scarred from dragon handling, his ponytail longer. "I could hear you lot from the garden. What's bloody hell? Is that dough climbing the wall?" "Long story," Arthur said, looking up from the parchment. "Or the short version is your brother enchanted the kitchen to only work properly when we all cook together." "Which brother?" Charlie asked, though his face suggested he already knew. "Fred." Charlie's expression softened immediately. Of course he did. The git. But there was love in his voice, the kind of affection that death doesn't diminish. Right then, what needs doing? This, Molly thought with a sudden rush of emotion, was what Fred had wanted. Her family, gathering in the kitchen without being asked, ready to help, ready to be together. She had to swallow hard against the lump in her throat. "Everything," she admitted. "The turkey's still frozen solid. We've got enough bread dough for a small army. I haven't even started on the vegetables for tomorrow, and the pudding needs its final steaming, and—" "Breathe, Mum," Bill said, squeezing her shoulder. "We've got this. Just tell us what to do." George climbed down from his chair, having successfully subdued the stockpot through a combination of determination and a promise that it could bubble merrily later. According to Fred's notes, the magic responds best to collaborative effort. So we need to divide tasks, but work in pairs or groups. Nobody does anything alone. "I can help Wizzy Pastry," Fleur offered, settling Victoire in Arthur's arms. The toddler immediately grabbed Arthur's nose with a delighted squeal. "I am quite good with the delicate work." "Brilliant," Molly said. "We'll need mince pie repairs. Some of yesterday's batch got a bit enthusiastic, and I wanted to make some sausage rolls for Boxing Day." Charlie rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms covered in old burn scars from dragonfire. "Put me on vegetable duty. I'm used to hacking up large quantities of meat for dragon feeding. Vegetables should be easier." "Oi, that's not exactly confidence-inspiring," George said. "But I'll help. Someone's got to make sure you don't treat the parsnips like dragon fodder." Bill surveyed the kitchen with the practiced eye of a curse breaker, assessing a dangerous situation. What about the turkey situation? If it's magically frozen, a regular thawing charm won't work. We'll need something more complex. "There's a counter-curse in Fred's notes," Arthur said, pointing to a section of the parchment. "But it requires 2 people to cast simultaneously. One to target the freezing enchantment, one to establish a warming field." "I'll do it with you, Dad," Bill said. "We've worked tandem spells before." Molly felt something unknot in her chest. They were taking over, taking charge, and instead of feeling useless or pushed aside, she felt relieved, grateful. Like a weight she'd been carrying for so long was finally being lifted and distributed among people who loved her. "Right then," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Let's sort out this kitchen." The next 2 hours were controlled chaos. Bill and Arthur disappeared into the pantry with wands drawn, working on the turkey situation. Molly could hear them discussing curse theory and magical thermal dynamics. Arthur's excited voice explaining some obscure principle, while Bill patiently redirected him toward the actual task at hand. Charlie and George attacked the vegetables with cheerful efficiency, though efficiency was perhaps generous. George insisted on teaching Charlie a silly song Fred had made up about chopping techniques, something about slice and dice and make it nice, parsnips dancing in a trice. And every time they sang it, the kitchen knives cooperated beautifully, moving in rhythm with the melody. "This is ridiculous," Charlie said, but he was grinning as he sang. "We're serenading root vegetables." "Fred would be so proud," George replied, his voice catching only slightly. Fleur had commandeered the worktop near the window, her delicate fingers flying through pastry preparation with the kind of grace that made Molly slightly jealous. Victoire sat in a charmed high chair beside her, playing with bits of dough that Fleur had spelled to be safe for baby hands. "Your son, he was very clever," Fleur said, as she rolled out pastry with quick, efficient movements. "This enchantment, it is beautiful magic. Complicated, yes, but beautiful. All about love and family." "That was Fred," Molly said, measuring out flour for a fresh batch of bread. Proper bread this time, to replace the dough that had staged its garden rebellion. Always thinking about feelings, even when he was pranking people. George was the showman, but Fred was the heart. Fleur glanced at her, those silvery eyes discerning. "You miss him very much." Every day, Molly admitted. Every single day. But this... She gestured around the kitchen, where her family worked and laughed and bickered good-naturedly. This is what he wanted, what he was trying to give me. A loud whoop from the pantry announced success. Bill emerged with Arthur, both of them looking triumphant and slightly singed around the edges. Between them floated the turkey, no longer frozen solid, its flesh yielding and ready for preparation. "Got it," Bill announced. "Took 3 attempts and Dad nearly set his beard on fire, but we did it." "I did not nearly set my beard on fire," Arthur protested. "It was barely smoking." "We'll call it barely smoking," Bill agreed diplomatically. Molly examined the turkey critically. It was perfect, thawed properly, the skin intact, ready for brining and eventually roasting. "Well done, both of you. Arthur, help me get it into the brine. Bill, see if George and Charlie need assistance with the vegetables." The kitchen settled into a productive rhythm. Molly and Arthur worked together at the sink, preparing the brine, salt, sugar, herbs, aromatics, and submerging the large turkey in the solution. Their movements were synchronized from decades of partnership, Arthur handing her things before she asked, Molly adjusting his measurements with gentle corrections. "This is rather nice," Arthur murmured as they worked. "Having everyone here, all together." "Don't sound so surprised. I've been trying to arrange this for months." "I know, love, but you've been trying to arrange it as something you did for everyone, not with everyone. There's a difference." Molly paused, her hands stilling in the brine water. "I just wanted..." "I know what you wanted, and it's lovely. But we want to take care of you too, Molly, not just be taken care of by you." She looked at her husband, his dear familiar face, his thinning hair, his eyes full of understanding, and felt tears prick at her eyes again, crying twice in one day. She was getting soft in her old age. "The pudding!" George's voice interrupted the moment. "Mum, when does the pudding need its final steaming?" "Right." The Christmas pudding, still sitting in its basin, waiting for its final 3-hour cook before tomorrow's dinner. Now, actually, it should have been on an hour ago. "I'll handle it," Charlie said, abandoning his vegetables. "Just tell me what to do." Molly walked him through the process, the steamer, the water level, the timing. Charlie listened intently, his dragon handler's focus translating surprisingly well to pudding preparation. Within minutes, the pudding was steaming away, filling the kitchen with its rich, spiced scent. "You're a natural," Molly told him. "It's just like monitoring dragon egg incubation," Charlie said seriously. "Constant heat, careful attention to timing, catastrophic consequences if you get it wrong." "Please don't compare my Christmas pudding to dragon eggs," Molly said, but she was smiling. The bread dough was behaving now, rising at a normal pace in its bowls. Fleur had produced 3 dozen perfect mince pies and had started on sausage rolls, her fingers crimping pastry with mechanical precision. George and Charlie had moved on from vegetables to cranberry sauce, following the recipe while improvising a harmony to go with Fred's chopping song. Bill appeared at Molly's elbow with a cup of tea. Actual tea, brewed in a kettle that had finally cooperated, and pressed it into her hands. "Sit for a minute, Mum. You've been on your feet since dawn. There's still so much to... And there are 6 adults here to do it. 7 if you count Victoire, though her contribution so far has been eating bits of pastry and giggling. Sit." Molly sat at the kitchen table, cradling the warm teacup, and watched her family work. Arthur was explaining something about Muggle cooking techniques to Charlie, who listened with genuine interest, despite clearly having no idea what a pressure cooker was. George and Bill had started a debate about the proper way to fold sausage rolls, George insisting on Fred's method of making them look like tiny sleeping bags, Bill arguing for traditional presentation. Fleur hummed as she worked, a French lullaby that made Victoire's eyes droop with sleepiness. The kitchen had settled into cooperation, the pots bubbling contentedly, the wooden spoons resting peacefully in their crock, only occasionally conducting a few bars of music before subsiding again. This was what Fred had seen, this moment, this gathering, this togetherness. He'd known, somehow known, that Molly needed this, needed to see that her family wanted to be part of the work, not just recipients of it. That home wasn't something she had to maintain alone. "Mum?" George had appeared beside her, his expression uncertain. "I was thinking, for tomorrow's dinner, maybe we could set an extra place. For Fred. Just, you know. So he's there with us." Molly's throat closed. She'd thought about it, of course. She thought about it every meal, every gathering, the absence that never stopped aching. But she'd been afraid to suggest it, afraid it would make everyone sad, would ruin the perfect Christmas she'd been trying to create. But Fred's enchantment had already ruined her perfect Christmas. Or rather, it had revealed that perfection was never what mattered. "I think that's a lovely idea," she said. "We'll set his place between you and Ron, like always." George's remaining ear went pink, but he was smiling. "He'd love this, you know. All of us crammed in here, making a mess of everything, singing stupid songs about vegetables. This is exactly the kind of Christmas he wanted." "Then that's the kind we'll have," Molly said firmly. The evening wore on. The kitchen transformed from disaster zone to productive workspace, though productive came with generous amounts of flour in hair, debates about proper seasoning, and one incident where Charlie accidentally charmed the potato peeler to work a bit too enthusiastically, and they all ended up covered in potato skin confetti. By the time they called it a night, the turkey was brining, the vegetables were prepped. Enough bread dough for Christmas morning was rising at a reasonable pace, and the pudding was steamed to perfection. They'd even managed to clean up most of the dough from the garden, though Molly suspected the chickens had eaten a fair amount of it, and would be laying very strange eggs for a while. Bill and Fleur took a sleeping Victoire up to their old room. Charlie, who'd always been able to sleep anywhere after years of dragon camp, claimed the sofa. George headed up to his room, not Fred's, never Fred's, though they'd offered, and Arthur began banking the fires for the night. Molly stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the space that had terrorized her all day. It was quiet now, peaceful, all the utensils in their places. But she could still feel the magic humming beneath the surface, patient and content. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, to the enchantment, to the sun who'd loved her enough to create this elaborate magical intervention. "Thank you, Fred." A wooden spoon in the crock shifted slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Then the kitchen fell silent, and Molly went upstairs to bed, exhausted but lighter than she'd felt in years. Tomorrow would be Christmas. Tomorrow her family would be together, all of them cooking and laughing, and making a beautiful mess of everything. It was going to be perfect. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright, frost painting intricate patterns on the kitchen windows. Molly woke before sunrise. Old habits died hard. But this time she lay in bed for a few extra minutes, listening to Arthur's gentle snoring, thinking about the day ahead. No detailed schedules today. No precise timetables or color-coded preparation lists. Just family, working together, making Christmas dinner happen, however it happened. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. She dressed and made her way downstairs, half expecting to find the kitchen in rebellion again. But it waited peacefully, the early morning light turning the copper pots into pools of liquid gold. The turkey sat in its brine in the cold larder. The pudding rested on its shelf, and the bread dough had risen to exactly the right height. No more garden-consuming explosions. Molly put the kettle on. It heated without complaint, whistling cheerfully when it reached boiling. Small mercies. She was halfway through her first cup of tea when she heard footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets, all arriving at once. Charlie appeared first, his hair sticking up at impossible angles, followed by Bill, looking annoyingly put together despite the early hour. George came last, moving slowly, the way he always did on mornings when Fred's absence felt particularly sharp. "Merry Christmas, Mum," they chorused with varying degrees of wakefulness. "Merry Christmas, my darlings." Molly rose to hug each of them in turn. "You're up early." "Dragon camp schedule," Charlie explained, helping himself to tea. "Up at dawn, sleep when the dragons let you, which is never." "I heard people moving and thought I should investigate," Bill said. "Old curse-breaker instincts." George just shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I might as well be useful." Arthur appeared next, already dressed in his newest jumper, the one Molly had knitted him in emerald green with a golden snitch pattern. Fleur drifted down shortly after, Victoire on her hip, looking impossibly elegant, even in her dressing gown. "Right then," Molly said, surveying her assembled family. "Percy and Audrey will be here by mid-morning. Ron sent word last night that he, Hermione, and Harry will arrive early afternoon. That gives us about 8 hours to prepare Christmas dinner." "No pressure," Charlie said cheerfully. "Actually," George said, pulling out Fred's parchment, now slightly crumpled and stained with various cooking residues. "According to these notes, the magic works best when we don't stress about timing. Something about joy in the process creating better results than anxiety about the product." Fred was always unexpectedly philosophical when he bothered to write things down. "So we just cook and trust it will work out?" Molly asked skeptically. "That appears to be the idea." Molly took a deep breath. Trust. Not her strongest quality, if she was honest. But Fred had trusted them, trusted her, enough to create this enchantment. The least she could do was trust him back. "All right, let's start with the turkey. It needs to come out of the brine, be dried, stuffed, and into the oven. Arthur, Bill, you two handled the thawing yesterday. Can you manage the preparation?" "We're on it," Bill said. He and Arthur headed for the cold larder, already discussing the finer points of turkey anatomy and optimal stuffing distribution. "Charlie, George, you're on breakfast duty. Everyone needs to eat before we tackle the main meal. Nothing complicated, just enough to keep us going." "Bacon and eggs?" Charlie suggested. "And toast. Lots of toast. We've got enough bread from yesterday to feed a Quidditch team." Fleur set Victoire in her charmed high chair and began measuring ingredients for what she announced would be proper French toast, not as is English sadness bread. Molly decided not to be offended. The kitchen came alive with activity. Pans clanged, water ran, the cooker's burners flickered to life with eager flames. But this time the chaos felt purposeful rather than malicious. The wooden spoons offered themselves to whoever needed them. The mixing bowls arranged themselves helpfully on the worktop. Even the temperamental oven seemed to be on its best behavior, maintaining a steady temperature without any wild fluctuations. George and Charlie worked side by side at the cooker, George frying bacon while Charlie attempted to flip eggs without breaking the yolks. He failed spectacularly on the first 3 attempts, producing scrambled eggs instead. But by the 4th try, he'd gotten the hang of it. "It's all in the wrist," George explained. "Like that time Fred taught us to skip stones on the pond. Same principle." "Everything with you two was same principle as something else," Charlie said, but he was smiling. "Remember when you convinced Ron that Quidditch tactics applied to chess? They do apply to chess. Ron lost every game for a month." "Exactly. He learned a valuable lesson about not trusting his older brothers." Arthur and Bill emerged from the cold larder, carrying the massive turkey between them, water dripping from its pale skin. They settled it in the largest roasting tin, the one that only came out for Christmas and other major occasions, and began the process of drying and preparing it. "Mum," Bill called, "what herbs go in the cavity?" Molly started to move toward them, then stopped. "You decide. Sage is traditional, but rosemary's nice too. Maybe some thyme, whatever feels right." Bill and Arthur exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her lack of specific instructions. Then Bill grinned. "You heard her, Dad. Let's get creative." Breakfast came together in fits and starts. Some bacon, slightly burnt, some eggs perfect, the French toast surprisingly delicious despite Molly's skepticism. They ate standing up, passing plates around, stealing bacon. From each other's portions, Victoire managing to get egg yolk in her hair despite Fleur's vigilant supervision. It was messy and chaotic, and nothing like Molly's usual organized meals. It was wonderful. Percy arrived just as they were clearing the breakfast dishes, Audrey beside him looking slightly nervous. Percy had that effect on people. His stiff ministry bearing and formal manner made even casual family gatherings feel like official business. But when he stepped into the kitchen and saw the organized chaos, Arthur elbow-deep in turkey stuffing, George teaching Charlie the proper technique for bread sauce, Bill covered in flour from making extra pastry, his formal expression cracked into something approaching genuine warmth. "Merry Christmas," he said, and actually meant it. "What can we do to help?" Audrey relaxed visibly. "I make excellent roast potatoes. Family recipe passed down 3 generations." "Perfect," Molly said. "We've got about 5 stone of potatoes that need parboiling, roughing up, and roasting. Charlie started them yesterday, but they need finishing. Consider it done." The kitchen grew more crowded. Percy, after changing into casual robes that Molly wasn't entirely sure she'd ever seen him wear before, took charge of the gravy station with the methodical precision he usually reserved for ministry reports. Audrey and Charlie bonded over potato preparation techniques, comparing family methods and arguing cheerfully about whether to use goose fat or olive oil. George had started on the Brussels sprouts, peeling away outer leaves and slicing crosses in the bases. Fred always said Brussels sprouts were like tiny cabbages having an identity crisis, he said to no one in particular. Never could decide if they wanted to be vegetables or tiny green stress balls. Philosophical observations from beyond the grave, Percy said dryly, but there was fondness in his voice. Very like him. The morning flowed into afternoon. The turkey went into the oven, filling the house with the smell of roasting meat and herbs. The potatoes sizzled in their hot fat. developing that perfect golden crust. The Christmas pudding reheated in its steamer, the house filling with scents of cinnamon, brandy, and dried fruit. Ron, Hermione, and Harry arrived at 2:30, tumbling through the door with bags of presents and breathless apologies about aura training running late. Ron's eyes went immediately to the kitchen. "Blimey, is everyone cooking?" "Fred's final prank," George explained, pulling his youngest brother into a hug. "Kitchen only works if we all help. Long story." "That's brilliant," Ron said, and Molly's heart swelled at the lack of pain in his voice when he said Fred's name. Time didn't heal, not exactly, but it softened the edges. "What needs doing?" "Vegetables," Molly said. "The parsnips need glazing, the sprouts need finishing, and someone needs to keep an eye on the bread sauce before it burns." "I'll take the bread sauce," Hermione volunteered immediately. "I've actually been reading about medieval cooking techniques, and the historical development of bread sauce is fascinating. Did you know it dates back to—" "Hermione?" Ron said gently. "Maybe save the lecture for after we've eaten?" "Right, sorry. I just think it's interesting." Harry, who'd been standing somewhat awkwardly in the doorway, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Weasley, is there something I can do?" Molly looked at him. This boy who'd lost so much, who'd never had a proper family Christmas until the Weasleys had adopted him into their chaos, and felt her eyes sting with tears. "Harry dear, come help me with the cranberry sauce. I made a batch yesterday, but I want to make a fresh one too, Percy's favourite." They worked together at the counter, Harry carefully measuring sugar while Molly sorted through fresh cranberries. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than love, his movements efficient, but slightly hesitant. "You know," Molly said quietly, "you're as much a part of this family as anyone else here. You don't have to ask permission to help." Harry's hand stilled over the measuring cup. "I know. Sometimes I still feel like a guest, you know, like I'm borrowing someone else's family." "Harry James Potter." Molly set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "You are not borrowing anything. This is your family. This is your home. Fred's enchantment, it responds to family, and it's working perfectly with you here." Harry's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Thank you, Molly." "Now," she said briskly, before they both started crying into the cranberries, "tell me how aura training is going. Ron mentioned something about you accidentally turning Dawlish's teacup into a toad." The afternoon wore on. The kitchen became impossibly crowded. 12 people in a space meant for maybe 6. But somehow everyone fit. They worked around each other, passing bowls and pans, taste-testing sauces, stealing bites of food, bickering good-naturedly about technique and timing. Bill taught Victoire to count using Brussels sprouts, much to Fleur's dismay. Percy and Arthur got into a heated debate about the structural integrity of Yorkshire pudding versus traditional dinner rolls. Ron managed to eat approximately half the roasted potatoes while testing them for doneness. And through it all, Fred's magic hummed contentedly, the kitchen cooperating beautifully now that its condition was met. Pots stirred themselves when needed, but stayed put when not. The oven maintained perfect temperature. Even the temperamental cooling rack behaved, no spinning or floating, just honest support for the mince pies and sausage rolls that emerged from the oven in waves. By 6 o'clock, only slightly later than Molly's original dinner time, everything was ready. The turkey, golden and perfect, was resting on the carving board. Mountains of roasted vegetables steamed in their dishes. The gravy was smooth and rich. The bread sauce was creamy. The cranberry sauce gleamed like rubies. The Christmas pudding waited for its dramatic flaming entrance. They migrated to the dining room, carrying dishes in a chaotic procession. The table, extended to its maximum length with all its extra leaves, groaned under the weight of food. Molly had set it this morning with her best dishes, the ones saved for special occasions, and the Christmas crackers she'd bought from Diagon Alley. At the head of the table sat Arthur. Down one side, Bill, Fleur with Victoire on her lap, Charlie and Percy with Audrey. Down the other side, George, then an empty place set with plate and silverware, then Ron, Hermione and Harry. At the foot of the table, Molly. George stood, raising his glass of pumpkin juice. "Before we eat, and trust me, I'm starving, so this will be brief, I want to make a toast." The table fell quiet, everyone lifting their glasses. "To Fred," George said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Who knew us all better than we knew ourselves? Who understood that the perfect Christmas wasn't about perfect food or perfect anything, really? It was about being together, making a mess, laughing at our mistakes, and loving each other through all of it. So here's to imperfect dinners, chaotic kitchens, and families who don't give up on each other. And here's to Fred, who's here with us anyway, whether we can see him or not." "To Fred," they chorused, glasses raised high. Molly looked around the table, at her family, whole and safe and together, and felt something settle in her chest. This wasn't the Christmas dinner she'd planned. The turkey was slightly lopsided, the potatoes were different sizes, the gravy was an odd colour. The bread rolls were various shapes. It was perfect. "Right then," Arthur said, picking up the carving knife. "Let's eat." And they did. Christmas morning light painted the Burrow's kitchen in shades of gold and amber, the low winter sun making everything glow as though the room itself remembered the magic of the day before. Molly stood at the sink, washing the last of the breakfast dishes by hand, a task she usually delegated to Magic. But this morning she found the rhythm of warm water and soap soothing, meditative. Behind her, the house was slowly waking. She could hear footsteps overhead, the creak of floorboards announcing various family members beginning their day. Someone, probably Ron, had already made a foray to the kitchen for an early morning snack, leaving crumbs and an empty plate as evidence. The leftover turkey sat in the cold larder, alongside containers of vegetables, gravy, and cranberry sauce. Yesterday's dinner had been everything George said it would be. Imperfect, chaotic, and absolutely wonderful. They'd eaten until they couldn't move, pulled Christmas crackers that released showers of sparks in various colours, and told stories late into the night, while the fire crackled. The snow fell softly outside. Molly had laughed until her sides hurt. She'd cried a little too, when George had read aloud a Christmas letter Fred had written years ago, full of terrible jokes and warm wishes. But the tears had felt different this time. Not the sharp grief of fresh loss, but something softer, gentler. Memory, rather than absence. The kitchen door opened, and Arthur shuffled in, wearing his dressing gown and the fuzzy slippers Ron had given him for Christmas. "Morning, love. You're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." Arthur came to stand beside her, picking up a tea towel to dry the dishes she'd washed. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, their movements synchronized from decades of partnership. "It was a good Christmas," Arthur said eventually. "It was." Molly handed him a plate. "Different from what I'd planned, but good." Better than what you'd planned, I think." She wanted to argue, but she couldn't. The dinner she'd originally envisioned, perfectly executed, every dish flawless, served by her alone while her family sat and waited, would have been beautiful. But it would have been lonely too, in its way. A performance, rather than a participation. "Fred knew," she said quietly. "He knew what I needed before I did. He was good at that. Both the twins were, really. But Fred especially. Always watching, always thinking about how to make people happy." More footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of Bill and Charlie, both looking rumpled and half awake. They'd stayed up late with Arthur, talking about Egypt and Romania, about dragon reserves and curse breaking, about lives lived far from home and the pull of family that always drew them back. "Morning," Bill mumbled, making straight for the kettle. "Is there tea?" "Always tea," Molly said. "There's fresh bread too, from yesterday's batch, and leftover sausage rolls if you're hungry." "I'm always hungry on Boxing Day," Charlie said, already pulling containers from the cold larder. "Something about Christmas dinner makes me ravenous the next morning, like my body's just catching up with all the food and demanding more." George appeared next, looking more alert than the others. He'd been up for a while, Molly suspected. She'd heard movement from his room around dawn. In his hands he carried Fred's parchment, now carefully smoothed and preserved between two sheets of protective charm work. "Morning," he said, setting the parchment on the kitchen table. "I was thinking about what we talked about yesterday, after dinner." They'd had a long conversation over the remains of the Christmas pudding, discussing Fred's enchantment, what it meant, how it had changed the way they thought about family gatherings. Percy had suggested, tentatively, in his careful way, that perhaps they shouldn't try to remove the enchantment, that maybe it should stay, a permanent part of the Burrow's magic. "I've been thinking about it too," Molly admitted. She dried her hands on her apron and came to sit at the table. The others followed, gathering around with their tea and toast, a spontaneous early morning meeting. "The enchantment isn't going anywhere," George said. "Fred built it to be permanent. It's woven into the structure of the house now, part of the Burrow's essential magic. We couldn't remove it even if we wanted to." "Do we want to?" Bill asked. They all looked at each other. Molly thought about yesterday, the chaos, the laughter, the way her kitchen had filled with family all working together. The way Ron had taught Harry proper gravy-making technique. The way Percy and Charlie had bonded over potato preparation. The way even little Victoire had participated, her chubby hands patting out pastry shapes that Fleur had baked into tiny cookies. "No," she said firmly, "I don't want to remove it. I want—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "I want to honor it, to embrace what Fred was trying to teach us." "A new tradition," Arthur said, understanding dawning on his face. "Not just for this Christmas, but for all of them going forward." "Exactly." Molly's heart beat faster with excitement. "Every Christmas, we all cook together. No more me slaving away alone while everyone else sits in the other room. No more perfect dinners that exhaust me and make everyone else feel useless. We do it as a family, mess and all." Charlie grinned. "Fred would love that." "He'd probably say it was about bloody time," George added, but his voice was warm with affection. The others began arriving as they talked, drawn by the smell of fresh tea and the sound of voices. Ron and Hermione came down together, followed by Harry, then Percy and Audrey, and finally Fleur, carrying a sleepy Victoire. They pulled up chairs, squeezed around the table, passed cups and plates in easy familiarity. "We're talking about making yesterday a tradition," Bill explained to the newcomers. "Every Christmas, everyone cooks together. It's what Fred's enchantment was designed for anyway." "I think that's wonderful," Hermione said immediately. "From an anthropological perspective, communal food preparation strengthens family bonds and creates shared experience that—" "We like it because it's fun," Ron interrupted gently. "Though yeah, what Hermione said too." "I've never really cooked before," Harry admitted. "Not properly, I mean. The Dursleys made me cook, but that was different. Lonely. Yesterday was—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "Part of something," Molly finished softly. "That's how it should be, Harry. Cooking together, eating together, being together. That's what makes a home." "It's settled then," Arthur said. "From now on, every Weasley Christmas dinner is a group effort. We'll even write it down, make it official." "I'll draft something," Percy offered, his bureaucratic instincts kicking in. Then he caught himself and smiled self-deprecatingly. "Though perhaps it doesn't need to be quite as formal as a ministry memorandum. Just a simple agreement," Audrey suggested. "Something we can all sign to show we're committed to it." George pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and a quill. "Right then, let's write this properly." They composed it together, everyone contributing ideas, arguing over wording, crossing out and rewriting until they had something that felt right. "The Weasley Family Christmas Accord we, the members of the Weasley family, and honorary members thereof, do hereby solemnly swear to uphold the following traditions for all future Christmas celebrations at the Burrow. 1. Christmas dinner shall be prepared collaboratively, with all able family members participating in the cooking process. 2. No single person shall bear the burden of preparation alone. Tasks shall be divided according to ability, interest, and whoever loses at scissors, paper, stone. 3. Perfection is not the goal. The goal is togetherness, laughter, and food made with love, even if it's slightly burnt or oddly shaped. 4. A place shall be set at the table for Fred Weasley in honor of the brother, son, and friend whose magic made this tradition possible. 5. Any family member who attempts to do all the cooking alone shall be subjected to aggressive, tickling charms and forced to sit down while others take over. 6. These traditions may be amended only by unanimous family vote. Victoire's vote shall be cast by her parents until she's old enough to throw food, at which point she gets a say. Signed this Boxing Day, in the year of our Lord 1998, at the Burrow, Ottery St. Catchpole, Devon. They passed the parchment around the table, each person signing their name. George signed twice. Once for himself, once for Fred, in his twin's familiar untidy scrawl that made Molly's eyes sting with tears. Harry hesitated before signing, looking at Molly uncertainly. "Your family, Harry," she said firmly. "Sign it." He did, his signature slightly wobbly with emotion. When everyone had signed, Arthur performed a preservation charm on the parchment, then stuck it to the kitchen wall with a permanent sticking charm. It hung beside the family clock, a new piece of Weasley history joining the old. "There," Molly said, stepping back to admire it. "It's official." "Mum," Ron said suddenly, "can we do Boxing Day lunch the same way? I'm starving, and there's loads of leftovers that need eating." "Ronald Weasley, we just finished breakfast." "I'm a growing boy." "You're 28 years old." "Still growing. Horizontally, maybe, but growing." Hermione rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. I'll help with lunch. I've been wanting to try that medieval bread pudding recipe I read about. We could use the leftover bread and—" "Here we go," Ron muttered. But he looked pleased. The rest of Boxing Day unfolded in comfortable chaos. They cooked together again, this time transforming leftovers into new creations. Turkey sandwiches, bubble and squeak, bread pudding that Hermione insisted on making, authentically medieval, despite everyone's protests. Friends began arriving in the afternoon. Various Weasley cousins, Neville Longbottom, looking happier than Molly had seen him in years. Luna Lovegood, wearing earrings that appeared to be made of Brussels sprouts. The house filled with noise and warmth and life. People spilled out into the garden despite the cold, engaging in an impromptu snowball fight that somehow escalated to include conjured snow fortifications and strategic planning that would have done Aura training proud. Inside, others played Exploding Snap, argued over Gobstone's rules, and told stories about Christmases past. Molly moved through it all with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't serving, wasn't managing, wasn't trying to control every detail. She was simply present, participating, being part of the gathering rather than its architect. In the late afternoon, she found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, the same spot where she'd stood on Christmas Eve morning, facing down the bread dough apocalypse. The room was full of people now. George and Luna were making something complicated, involving leftover pudding and custard. Harry and Ron were engaged in what appeared to be a competition to see who could stack sandwiches higher. Percy was explaining the finer points of ministry filing systems to a politely bewildered Neville. The wooden spoons in their crock swayed gently, conducting an invisible orchestra. The copper pots gleamed on their hooks. The oven hummed contentedly. Fred's magic, satisfied and content, woven permanently into the home he'd loved. Arthur appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking," Molly said slowly, "about how badly I wanted everything to be perfect, how much energy I put into trying to create the ideal Christmas, the ideal family moment, as if perfection could somehow protect us, or prove we were all right despite everything we'd lost. And now I think Fred was trying to tell me that we don't need protection. We just need each other, messy and imperfect and absolutely real." Arthur kissed her temple. He was a wise boy in his way. He was. They both were. She corrected herself, glancing at George, who just said something that made Luna laugh so hard she snorted. As evening fell, people began departing. Cousins back to their own homes, friends to their own celebrations. The family gathered in the sitting room, too full and too tired to do much more than collapse onto sofas and chairs. Victoire had fallen asleep in Bill's arms. Charlie was dozing in the armchair. Even Ron had stopped eating, which Molly took as a sign of genuine satisfaction. George sat on the floor near the fireplace, Fred's parchment, the original one with all his notes and diagrams, spread out before him. He'd been studying it on and off all day, piecing together the full scope of what his twin had created. "You know what's mad?" he said into the comfortable silence. "Fred designed this enchantment 3 years ago, before the war really kicked off, before we knew how bad things would get, before," his voice caught, "before we knew we wouldn't both survive it." "George," Molly said gently. "No, wait, let me finish." He looked up at her, his face, so like Fred's, yet distinctly his own, serious and thoughtful. "He designed it because he knew you, Mum. Knew you'd try to take care of everyone alone, knew you'd work yourself to exhaustion trying to prove we were still a whole family. He was trying to protect you, in his way, to make sure you'd let us help." George's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I think he knew something else, too. I think part of him knew he might not be here to see it work. That's why he made it permanent, why he documented everything so carefully. This was his way of staying, of still being part of the family, even after he couldn't finish." Molly crossed the room and pulled him into her arms, this son who'd lost the other half of himself and somehow kept going. "He's still here," she said fiercely, "in this magic, in our memories, in you. He's still here, George." "I know." George's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Some days it doesn't feel like enough. But then something like this happens, and I can feel him laughing, can practically hear him saying, 'Told you so,' about the kitchen chaos." "He would be insufferable about being right," Ron agreed from his spot on the sofa. "Absolutely unbearable," Percy added. "We'd never hear the end of it," Fleur said, her accent thickening with emotion. "We'd love every minute of it," Harry said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the weight of grief and love and memory settling over them like a blanket. It wasn't comfortable, exactly. Grief never was, but it was bearable, shared. "Next Christmas," Charlie said eventually, "I want to be in charge of the turkey again. I've got some ideas about dragonfire roasting techniques that I think would really—" "Absolutely not," Molly said immediately. "You haven't even heard my full plan." "I don't need to. Dragonfire and poultry do not mix, Charles Weasley. But think of the crispy skin. I'm thinking of the explosion." The conversation dissolved into laughter and arguments about proper cooking methods, about who would be responsible for what next year, about whether they should attempt a Boxing Day cooking tradition too, or if that was pushing their luck. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, Molly found herself looking around the room at her family, her loud, chaotic, imperfect, absolutely perfect family. They'd survived war and loss and grief that should have broken them. But here they were, together, planning next Christmas before this one had even properly ended. Fred had known, had understood that the thing that would save them, that would keep them whole, wasn't perfection or protection or trying to freeze time in amber. It was exactly this, being together, helping each other, allowing themselves to be messy and human and real. His magic had taught them that. His final gift, delivered 3 years late, but exactly on time. "Mum," Ginny's voice came from the doorway. Molly hadn't even heard her arrive. She'd been staying with the Harpies team for their holiday training, but had promised to stop by Boxing Day evening. "Ginny!" Molly leapt up to embrace her youngest, her only daughter. "I didn't hear you come in. Just got here. Stopped in the kitchen first. Someone told me about Fred's enchantment." Ginny's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Can I see it? The notes, I mean." George handed over the parchment without hesitation. Ginny read it slowly, her fingers tracing Fred's handwriting, and by the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "That absolute prat," she said, her voice thick, "making us all cry on Christmas. How very like him." "We signed an accord," Ron told her, "making it official. Every Christmas we all cook together. You need to add your signature." They trooped back to the kitchen, all of them crowding around the parchment stuck to the wall. Ginny signed her name in her bold, athletic script, then stepped back. There, now it's really official. Molly stood in her kitchen, her beloved, chaotic, enchanted kitchen, surrounded by her family, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. The Burrow would never be perfect. Christmas dinners would never go exactly as planned. There would always be burnt edges and lopsided pastries and vegetables that weren't quite the right size. But there would also be laughter, togetherness, love made tangible in shared effort and shared meals. And somewhere in the magic that hummed through the walls and whispered in the corners, Fred was smiling. Right then, Molly said, looking around at her assembled family. Who wants tea? And don't everyone rush to help at once. We've still got to leave room for the kitchen to breathe. I'll put the kettle on, Arthur volunteered. I'll get the cups, said Bill. I'll find the biscuits, Ron added predictably. And I, said George, grinning, will conduct the wooden spoons. Someone has to keep Fred's tradition alive. The kitchen erupted in activity and laughter, everyone finding something to do, some way to help. The magic purred contentedly around them. Fred's final prank transformed into Fred's greatest gift. And on the wall, the Weasley family Christmas accord hung proud and permanent, a promise and a memory and a new beginning all at once. The most beloved Weasley Christmas tradition had begun.